My name is Ava Morrison, and I'm 30 years old. At least at the beginning of this story, I believed I had already accepted my place in the Morrison family, the invisible one. The dependable daughter, the one who fixed problems quietly while everyone else celebrated my older brother. If you think family betrayal always arrives with screaming arguments and shattered dishes, you're wrong. Sometimes it arrives with a phone call on an ordinary Friday evening, and sometimes the person who destroys everything is the one your parents never stopped believing in. My brother Josh Morrison is 3 years older than me, 33, and for as long as I can remember, he was the golden child. When we were kids, Josh brought home perfect report cards. He won academic awards. Teachers loved him. Neighbors praised him. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one who actually did the work, but rarely received the applause. Apparently, childhood achievements matter more than adult character in the Morrison household. But golden children often fall the hardest. And when Josh fell, he nearly destroyed everything my father had built. 3 years ago, Josh was working at our family's construction company, Morrison & Sons Building Solutions. The name sounded traditional, old-fashioned, almost noble. Dad started it 30 years ago with nothing but a rusty pickup truck and a toolbox full of borrowed equipment. By the time Josh joined after college, the company had become one of the most respected contractors in Arizona. We built custom homes in Scottsdale, renovated luxury resorts, managed commercial projects across Phoenix, and Josh seemed destined to inherit it all. He had the corner office, Dad's trust, and the assumption from everyone that one day he would take over. Meanwhile, I worked across town at Henderson Construction, one of Morrison & Sons' biggest competitors. That wasn't an accident. I deliberately chose another company because I refused to work under Josh. Call it pride. Call it stubbornness. But the idea of reporting to my older brother, watching him receive credit for everything, made my stomach turn. At Henderson, I built my own career. 8 years climbing the ladder. A business degree from Arizona State University. Project management certifications. Late nights analyzing contracts and budgets. For the first time in my life, I was known as more than Josh's little sister. But everything changed in the span of 1 week. It started on a Tuesday morning when Dad discovered irregularities in the company accounts. At first, he assumed it was a bookkeeping error. Maybe their accountant, Mrs. Rodriguez, had misfiled something in the quarterly reports. But the deeper they looked, the worse it became. Thousands missing, then tens of thousands, then more. By the end of the investigation, the truth was impossible to ignore. Josh had been embezzling money for months, not pocket change. Over $200,000. Casino trips to Las Vegas that we believed were business networking events were actually desperate attempts to win back money he had already lost. The expensive dinners, the brand new BMW, the designer suits, all of it had been paid for with stolen money. Money from the company our father had spent 30 years building. When Dad confronted him, Josh didn't even deny it. He just sat in that leather office chair Dad had proudly bought for him, staring at the floor. The golden child had finally cracked. But the decision my father made next changed everything. Instead of calling the police like any rational business owner would, he kept it in the family. No criminal charges, no public scandal, just a quiet termination and a promise from Josh that he would disappear until he figured things out. Within a week, Josh was gone. No forwarding address, no phone calls, nothing. It was like he had vanished from the planet. And that Friday evening, my phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table in our house in Tempe. My husband, Ethan, was cooking his famous barbecue chicken, while our 8-year-old daughter, Lily, practiced piano in the living room. Everything felt peaceful, normal. I should have known that wouldn't last. Ava, Dad's voice sounded weak, older than I had ever heard it before. I need your help. Those words hung in the air between us for several seconds. My father, Robert Morrison, was not a man who asked for help easily. For 30 years, he had been the type who solved problems with his own hands, whether that meant fixing a broken roof beam or negotiating a multi-million-dollar construction contract. But the voice I heard on the phone that night didn't sound like the confident builder who had raised Morrison and Sons from nothing. It sounded like a man who had just watched his life collapse. "Dad," I said slowly, standing up from the kitchen table. "What happened?" There was a long silence, then a heavy sigh. "Josh is gone." The words were flat, empty, and he left us in a real mess. Ethan noticed my expression immediately. He lowered the heat on the grill and leaned against the kitchen doorway, watching me carefully. "What kind of mess?" I asked. Dad began explaining everything. The missing money, the gambling debts, the fake invoices, the financial chaos Josh had left behind. But what frightened my father most wasn't the money. It was the projects. Josh had been managing 3 of Morrison and Sons' biggest contracts at the time. Now they were on the verge of collapsing. "We have the Henderson custom home in Paradise Valley," Dad said. "They're furious about delays. The Wilson's restaurant renovation is already 2 weeks behind schedule. And the Thompson office complex project. I honestly don't even know where to start with that disaster." I rubbed my forehead. Those were huge contracts. If they failed, Morrison and Sons could lose its reputation overnight. "I know you have your own career," Dad continued quietly, "but you're the only person I trust who understands construction and the financial side of this business." Ethan watched me closely. He knew what Dad was asking, even before the words came. "I need you to come work with me, Ava." My heart pounded. For my entire childhood, my father had spoken about the company's future like it belonged to one person. Josh, never me. Never his daughter. But now Josh was gone, and the business was falling apart. "If I leave Henderson," I said carefully, "this can't be temporary." Dad hesitated. "I'm not walking away from 8 years of work just to clean things up until Josh decides to come back." "Ava," Dad said softly, "after what Josh did, I don't know if he'll ever come back. And even if he does, I don't know if I could trust him again." That was the closest thing to an admission I had ever heard from him. I glanced at Ethan. He stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You already know what you're going to do," he said quietly. I exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I did." I gave Henderson Construction my 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. My boss looked stunned. "You're leaving to work for Morrison and Sons?" he asked. "That's right." He leaned back in his chair. "I thought you deliberately avoided that place." "I did," I said, "but family circumstances changed." He studied me for a moment. "Well," he finally said, "if anyone can fix a disaster like that company is facing, it's you." My first day at Morrison and Sons felt like walking into a construction site after a tornado. The office was chaos. Stacks of unpaid invoices covered Josh's abandoned desk. Contractors were calling nonstop, asking about delayed payments. And Mrs. Rodriguez, the company accountant, looked like she hadn't slept in a week. When she saw me walk in, she practically ran across the room. "Thank God you're here," she said. She dropped a thick stack of financial reports into my arms. "I've been trying to untangle what Josh did to the books, but it's like he deliberately made everything impossible to understand." She wasn't exaggerating. Josh hadn't just stolen money. He had created a maze. Fake invoices, duplicate payments, phantom subcontractors, expenses that didn't exist. It was as if he had been preparing his escape long before anyone noticed. But there was one advantage I had always possessed over my brother. I understood systems. Where Josh relied on charm and confidence, I relied on structure, organization, numbers. For the next 2 weeks, I barely slept. I created entirely new accounting protocols, digitized the financial records, built project tracking systems that allowed us to monitor every construction phase in real time. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the clients. The Henderson family was furious about delays on their Paradise Valley mansion. The Wilsons were threatening to sue over their restaurant renovation. And the Thompson office complex project had become such a disaster that contractors were refusing to continue work without immediate payments. Every meeting felt like walking into a battlefield. I spent hours apologizing, negotiating, promising solutions. Sometimes I succeeded. Sometimes I barely avoided losing the contracts entirely. But slowly, Piece by piece, the chaos began to stabilize. The workload was brutal. For the first month, I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Ethan barely saw me. Most nights, I came home exhausted, collapsing into bed before dinner. One evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with Lily. Our daughter was coloring quietly while Ethan stared at the clock. "You missed her recital tonight," he said gently. Guilt stabbed through my chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Lily looked up and smiled anyway. "It's okay, Mommy." But it wasn't okay. Not really. Later that night, Ethan sat beside me while I reviewed contractor bids on my laptop. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said. I rubbed my tired eyes. "If I don't fix this company soon, Dad could lose everything he's worked for." Ethan sighed. "I know." Then he squeezed my hand. "But you don't have to carry the entire world on your shoulders." Despite the exhaustion, something strange started happening. I began to love the work. Fixing broken systems, saving failing projects, rebuilding the company Josh had nearly destroyed. Every success felt personal. Every completed project felt like proof that I belonged here, and my father noticed. He began asking my opinion about major decisions, inviting me to strategy meetings, trusting me with financial planning. One evening, we locked up the office around 9 o'clock. Dad stood quietly beside me in the parking lot. "You know something?" he said. "What?" "I should have asked you to join the company years ago." I looked at him, surprised. "You have a head for this business that Josh never did." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. It was the kind of recognition I had spent my entire childhood hoping for. By the end of my first year, Morrison & Sons was stable again. By the end of the second year, it was growing. And by the third year, the company was thriving. We secured 2 major contracts, a luxury resort renovation in Sedona, and a new shopping center project in Chandler. Clients began requesting to work with me specifically. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged in the Morrison legacy. My father had started stepping back from daily operations. Most decisions now passed through me. Ethan had even started helping with marketing for the company, bringing in younger clients with creative ideas. Life finally felt balanced. Then one morning in March, everything changed. I was reviewing blueprints for the Sedona project when Dad's phone rang across the office. At first, I didn't pay attention until I heard him say 3 words that made my blood run cold. "Josh, is that really you?" The second my father said, "Josh, is that really you?" my entire body went cold. It wasn't logical. Josh had been gone for 3 years. A full 1,000 days of silence. No calls, no texts, no postcards from some distant city. Nothing. But the moment I heard his name, my mind snapped back to childhood, back to the way my parents' faces lit up whenever he entered a room, like sunlight had finally arrived. I watched Dad as he stood near the blueprints, phone pressed to his ear. His expression shifted rapidly. Shock, relief, anger, confusion, all cycling so fast it looked like his face couldn't decide which emotion belonged where. He kept saying things like, "Where have you been?" and "Are you okay?" and "We've been worried sick." My hands clenched around the edge of my desk. Part of me wanted to snatch the phone away and hang it up. 3 years of rebuilding this company. 3 years of saving his life's work. 3 years of proving I was capable. And with one phone call, Josh was suddenly the center of the universe again. When Dad finally hung up, he stood very still, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he was waiting to see if he'd fall. "That was your brother," he said, like he needed to hear the words out loud to believe them. "I heard," I replied, forcing my voice to stay neutral. Dad swallowed. "He's been in Seattle." Seattle. The name sounded too clean, too convenient, like a setting in a redemption story someone would write. "He says he's gotten his life together," Dad continued. "He wants to come home." I stared at him. "Doing what in Seattle?" I asked. Dad blinked as if the question hadn't occurred to him until now. He said he worked construction, started at the bottom, got clean, therapy, meetings, all of it. The words "got clean" made something bitter rise in my throat. Josh had stolen over $200,000 from our family business. He had gambled away our employees' paychecks, our contracts, our reputation. Then he vanished and left us to burn. And now he was calling from Seattle with a neat little redemption arc. "Dad," I said carefully, "you remember what happened last time, right?" His face tightened. "Of course I remember." "Because it sounds like you're already preparing to welcome him back, like none of it mattered." Dad's eyes flashed with irritation. "He's still my son, Ava." "And I'm your daughter," I said quietly. He looked away as if that sentence was harder to hold than the truth about Josh. "I'm not saying I'm going to hand him the company," Dad muttered, defensive. But I didn't miss the hopeful softness in his eyes. The same softness that used to appear when Josh brought home trophies. That softness scared me more than anger ever could. 2 weeks later, Josh arrived in Phoenix. Dad insisted we bring him into the office first, before any big family gathering, so he could see what we'd built. What I had built. Josh walked in wearing a simple button-down shirt and worn jeans. No expensive watch, no designer shoes, no smug grin. He looked different, thinner, more weathered, gray threaded through his hair at the temples, making him look older than 33. When he saw me, he paused. For a heartbeat, his eyes flickered with something that almost looked like shame. "Ava," he said softly, stepping forward. He extended his hand like we were strangers meeting at a conference instead of siblings whose shared history was packed with landmines. I stared at his hand. Then I shook it. Only because Dad was watching. "I owe you an apology," Josh said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "A big one." I didn't respond. Josh's gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted again. "I know what I did was unforgivable. The gambling, the stealing, the way I disappeared. I destroyed everything Dad built and left you to clean it up." He swallowed, and for a moment his eyes glistened. "I can't ever make that right," he continued. "But I want you to know I'm grateful, really grateful." He sounded sincere. He looked sincere. But Josh had always been talented at sounding like whatever people wanted to hear. Dad's expression softened immediately. "We're just glad you're alive, son." I felt my stomach twist. Alive. Like that was the only standard he had to meet. As if survival was the same as accountability. "What do you want?" I asked bluntly. Josh blinked at my tone, then glanced at Dad like he was seeking permission before answering. "I want to make amends," he said. "I want to be part of this family again, and if you'll let me, I want to help rebuild what I destroyed." The words were perfectly crafted. A confession without consequences. A promise without specifics. A plea for forgiveness that positioned him as humble and brave for returning. Dad clasped his shoulder, visibly emotional. And I stood there, smiling tightly, because I had learned long ago that in this family, my anger was inconvenient. Dad insisted on hosting a family dinner to welcome Josh home. It was at my parents' house in North Phoenix, the same house we grew up in. The hallway still held framed photos of Josh and me as children. School pictures, holiday snapshots, forced smiles that looked happier in print than they ever felt in real life. Ethan squeezed my hand as we walked in with Lily. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. I wanted to believe him. The smell of pot roast filled the air, Mom's specialty, always served when she wanted the night to feel safe and normal. Mom hugged Lily, wiping at her eyes. "My baby girl has gotten so big." Josh appeared from the living room like a ghost stepping out of the past. He hugged Mom first, and she broke down crying instantly. Then he hugged Dad, and Dad held him too long, too tightly. Finally, Josh turned toward me and Ethan. He hesitated, then gave me a careful, gentle embrace, like he was trying not to trigger an explosion. Ethan shook his hand politely. Lily stared at Josh with curiosity. "That's Uncle Josh?" she whispered to me. "Yes," I said quietly. Josh smiled at her. "Hi, Lily. I've heard so much about you." Something about that bothered me. How had he heard about her? From who? Dad? Mom? It felt like he'd been studying the family from a distance, collecting details so he could slide back in seamlessly. During dinner, Josh delivered his story. Seattle. Rock bottom. living in his car for 2 months, a small construction crew that gave him a second chance. Therapy. Gambling addiction recovery meetings. He spoke with just enough emotion at just the right moments. Mom cried. Dad nodded, proud, like this was a graduation speech. Even Lily listened like she was hearing a bedtime story about a lost prince returning home. But I kept noticing tiny things. How Josh never mentioned the exact company he worked for. How he never explained why he never called. How his story sounded rehearsed. Like he'd practiced it into a smooth narrative that left no room for questions. After dessert, Dad stood up and tapped his wine glass with a fork. I want to make an announcement, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My pulse spiked. Here it comes, I thought. He's going to officially welcome Josh back into the business. Maybe give him a small role. Maybe put him under my supervision. I could live with that, as long as I stayed in control. As you all know, Dad began, Ava has done an incredible job these past 3 years. A warm glow started to rise in my chest. Public recognition. Finally. She saved this company, Dad continued, and I will never be able to thank her enough for that. Ethan's hand tightened around mine under the table. Mom nodded, sniffing. Even Josh looked at me with something like respect. For one fleeting moment, I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe I'm finally being seen. Then Dad said one word. But that single word sliced through the room like a blade. Family is family, Dad said. And now that Josh has gotten his life together, now that he's ready to take responsibility, no. My heart hammered. No, no, no. When I retire in 2 years, Dad announced, Josh will be taking over as CEO of Morrison & Sons. The room went silent except for the ticking of Mom's antique clock. Ethan's fork slipped from his hand and clinked against the plate. Lily looked confused, glancing between us, like she could sense the air had turned dangerous. Mom's face softened with relief. Josh's eyes widened, like he couldn't believe his luck. And I sat frozen, feeling something inside me crack. 3 years, 16-hour days. Sacrifices, missed recitals, broken sleep, all of it, erased with a sentence. Dad looked at me like he expected gratitude, like he expected me to smile. But all I could think was, even now, even after everything, I'm still second place. I slowly pushed my chair back. Absolutely not, I said, my voice quiet but deadly. Absolutely not. The words came out calm, too calm. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound in the dining room was the slow ticking of my mother's antique clock on the mantel. Dad frowned slightly, like he thought he had misheard me. Ava, he said carefully, I understand this might come as a surprise. No, I interrupted, standing up slowly. You don't understand. My chair scraped across the floor as I pushed it back. I will not work under him. Mom's hand flew to her chest. Ava. Not after everything that happened, I continued. Not after everything I've done to save that company. Josh looked stunned. Ava, I didn't ask for this. I turned toward him sharply. Of course you didn't ask for it, I said bitterly. You never have to ask for anything. It's always just handed to you. The words hung heavy in the room. Dad's voice hardened. That's enough. No, I said quietly. Actually, it isn't. 3 years of exhaustion. 3 years of proving myself. 3 years of believing I had finally earned a place in this family. All of it rushed through my chest at once. You want him to run the company? I asked Dad. Dad lifted his chin. Josh is the eldest. He has the most experience with the business. I stared at him. The absurdity of it made me laugh under my breath. Experience? Josh shifted uncomfortably. You mean the experience of stealing $200,000 and disappearing for 3 years? Mom whispered, Ava, please. But I couldn't stop now. You mean the experience of leaving the company in ruins while I spent 3 years fixing it? Dad's face darkened. That's not fair. Not fair, I repeated. My voice was still calm, but the anger inside it was beginning to burn. You know what isn't fair? Watching someone destroy everything and still get rewarded for it. Josh looked down at the table. I said I was sorry, he muttered. Sorry doesn't fix a company, I replied coldly. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. Ava, he said quietly, maybe we should step outside. No, I said softly. I looked directly at Dad. If Josh is taking over the company, I paused. Then I quit. Mom gasped. Dad stood up abruptly. Ava, don't be ridiculous. I'm not being ridiculous, I said. I'm being honest. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Ethan, I said gently, can you take Lily to the car? Lily looked confused, her eyes moving between the adults like she could sense the emotional earthquake happening around her. Are we leaving already? She asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart, I said. Ethan nodded and stood up, guiding Lily toward the hallway. Dad stepped forward. Ava, sit down. We're going to talk about this rationally. I'm done talking. My voice surprised even me. It sounded final, like a door slamming shut. Mom's eyes filled with tears. He's still your brother. I looked at her. No, I said quietly. A brother doesn't steal from his family. A brother doesn't disappear for 3 years. And a brother doesn't come back and take credit for the work someone else did. Josh flinched. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at Dad, the man whose approval I had chased my entire life. You made your choice, I said, and now I'm making mine. As we walked toward the front door, I could hear Mom crying behind us. Dad called my name, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in my life, I refused to chase their approval. Outside, the cool desert air hit my face. Josh followed us onto the driveway. Ava, wait! I turned slowly. He stood there under the porch light, looking almost desperate. I had no idea Dad was going to say that, he said quickly. I never asked for the company. Sure you didn't, I replied. Ava, I mean it. His voice cracked slightly. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I'm trying to fix things. I opened the car door for Lily. You already fixed things, I said quietly. You got everything you wanted. Josh looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't, because deep down, he knew it was true. Ethan got into the driver's seat while I climbed into the passenger side. As we pulled away, I saw Dad standing in the doorway, watching. But I didn't look back again. That night, I sat in my home office until almost 2 a.m. The house was quiet. Ethan had gone to bed with Lily hours earlier. My laptop screen glowed in the dark. I typed slowly. Every word deliberate. Every sentence final. Subject, formal resignation. By the time I hit send, my hands were shaking. 3 years of my life, gone with one email. The next morning, I started updating my resume. Construction project management, financial restructuring, corporate recovery. I had saved a company. Surely someone would want to hire me, right? 2 months passed. And reality hit harder than I expected. The construction industry in Phoenix was tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. And word about the Morrison family drama had spread quickly. Some companies were interested in my experience. Others were wary. Walking away from a family business can be complicated, one hiring manager told me carefully during an interview. Complicated. That was our savings began shrinking faster than I liked. We stopped eating out, canceled Lily's dance classes for the summer. Even small things like her favorite pizza place became luxuries we avoided. Ethan never complained, but I could see the worry in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, Lily asked a question that hit me harder than any rejection email. Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Why don't you go to work anymore? I swallowed. Mommy's looking for a new job right now. Oh. She thought about that for a moment. Did you get fired? The question stung. No, I said softly. I chose to leave. Lily nodded slowly. Then she hugged me. And for a moment, I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. That night, I sat in my office reviewing another job application. It was almost 11 p.m. when my phone rang. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Dad. We hadn't spoken since the dinner, not once. I stared at the phone for several seconds. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring until silence returned. But something about the timing felt wrong. Slowly, I answered. Hello? Ava. Dad's voice sounded different. Not angry, not defensive, just scared. Can you come over? I frowned. What happened? There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, "Something's happened with Josh." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Dad's words echoed in the silence of my office. Something's happened with Josh. The irony almost made me laugh. Josh had already happened. He had happened 3 years ago when he stole from the company. He had happened again 2 months ago when he walked back into our lives and took everything I had worked for. What else could possibly be left? What kind of something? I asked finally. Dad sounded exhausted. "Please, just come over. Your mother and I, we need you." His voice cracked slightly. I closed my eyes. Despite everything, he was still my father. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said. The drive across Phoenix felt longer than usual. The desert night was quiet, the roads nearly empty. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house lights were still on. That alone told me something was wrong. Mom never stayed up this late. When I stepped inside, the air felt heavy. Dad sat in the living room with his elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet like it held the answer to a problem he couldn't solve. Mom sat beside him, clutching a tissue. Her eyes were red. They both looked older than the last time I had seen them. "Ava," Mom whispered when she saw me. I sat down across from them. "Okay," I said quietly. "What happened?" Dad rubbed his face slowly. Then he said the last thing I expected. "Josh hasn't changed." I leaned back slightly. "What do you mean?" Dad let out a long breath. "Everything he told us about Seattle, about getting his life together." He shook his head. "It was all a lie." For a second, the room was silent. Then I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that comes when something painful becomes completely predictable. "Shocking," I said flatly. Mom winced. Dad continued. "Josh didn't work construction in Seattle." "Then what did he do?" "Nothing stable," Dad admitted. "He's been bouncing between cities, getting fired from jobs, gambling again." I felt the anger rising in my chest again. So the redemption story was just another performance. Dad nodded slowly. "The only reason he came back to Phoenix is because he ran out of money." Of course, Josh never came back because he loved us. He came back because he needed something. "What does he want this time?" I asked. Mom swallowed. "Money." "How much?" Dad hesitated. Then he said quietly, $80,000. I stared at him. Then I shook my head slowly. 80,000. The number sounded absurd. "And let me guess," I continued, "if he doesn't get it, something terrible will happen?" Mom's voice trembled. "He owes money to some very dangerous people in Las Vegas. They've been calling him, threatening him. They said if he doesn't pay soon." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I crossed my arms. "So what did you tell him?" Dad looked ashamed. "We told him no." For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of respect. "Good. We don't have that kind of liquid cash," Dad continued. "The business is doing well, but most of the money is tied up in equipment and active projects." "So that's the end of it," I said. Dad shook his head slowly. "No. He wanted us to take out a second mortgage on the house." My jaw tightened. "And?" "We refused." "What did he do?" Mom hesitated. Then she slowly pulled up the sleeve of her sweater. A deep bruise darkened her forearm. My vision went red. "He did that to you?" I asked quietly. Mom rushed to explain. "He didn't mean to. He just grabbed my arm when we said no. He was scared and angry." "Don't defend him," I snapped. The anger I had suppressed for years was boiling over. Dad spoke quietly. After that, he stormed out, said he was done with all of us. "Good," I said immediately. "You should be done with him too." Dad leaned forward. "Ava, I owe you an apology." I looked at him carefully. He rarely said those words. "I was wrong," he continued. "About Josh. And about you." The room felt very still. "You saved Morrison & Sons," Dad said. And instead of recognizing that, I let nostalgia and wishful thinking blind me. His voice trembled slightly. I wanted to believe Josh could change, but I ignored the person who actually proved themselves. The words landed heavily. For years, I had wanted to hear my father say that, but now it felt strangely hollow. Like a reward given long after the race was over. "I want you to come back," Dad said quietly. I blinked. "What?" "To the company. Not as operations manager. Not under Josh." He looked directly at me. as my partner. Mom nodded through her tears. Full partnership, Dad continued. And when I retire, his voice softened. The company will be yours. No hesitation, no conditions. Just a clear statement. The kind I had hoped for 3 years ago. And Josh? I asked. Dad's jaw tightened. Josh is out. For good this time. Silence filled the room again. I studied my parents carefully. They looked tired, defeated, like the weight of years of denial had finally crushed them. Josh had broken something inside them, and now they were looking at me like I was the only person who could put the pieces back together. But accepting Dad's offer wasn't simple. It meant trusting them again, trusting the same people who had chosen Josh over me, again and again. I need time to think, I said finally. Dad nodded immediately. Of course. Take all the time you need. Then he looked at me with something I had rarely seen in his eyes before. Regret. Ava, I hope someday you can forgive a foolish old man who let sentiment override common sense. When I drove home that night, the city lights blurred past the windshield. For the first time in 2 months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But hope can be dangerous, because hope means trusting again, and trust had always been the most fragile thing in my family. It has been 6 months since that late-night phone call from my father. Right now, I'm sitting in a familiar room that somehow feels completely different. The corner office at Morrison & Sons. My father's old office. The large windows overlook the Phoenix skyline. The same skyline he stared at for decades while building the company from a single pickup truck and a toolbox. Now the desk belongs to me. But I didn't return immediately. After that conversation with my parents, I made them wait 2 weeks. 2 long weeks. During that time, Ethan and I talked about it constantly. Late at night, over breakfast, while helping Lily with her homework. You don't owe them anything, Ethan reminded me more than once. I know, I said, but family is complicated, even when they hurt you. Especially when they hurt you. What do you want? Ethan asked one evening as we sat on the couch. I thought about that question carefully. For most of my life, what I wanted had been simple. I wanted to be seen, to be valued, to be recognized for the work I had done instead of being compared to my brother. Now that opportunity was sitting right in front of me, but it came wrapped in years of disappointment. Finally, after 2 weeks of thinking, I called Dad. I'll come back, I told him. There was a long pause on the phone. Then I heard him exhale like someone had just lifted a mountain off his shoulders. The transition happened faster than I expected. Within a month, the legal paperwork was finalized. Dad officially stepped down as CEO. I took over full operational control of Morrison & Sons. The first time I sat in the corner office alone, the weight of it almost overwhelmed me. This was the office Josh once believed would be his. The office my father had assumed would belong to his eldest son. Now it belonged to me, the invisible daughter. The business itself was stronger than ever. During the months I was gone, the company had remained stable, thanks to the systems I had built. When I returned, we began expanding almost immediately. Our biggest breakthrough came 3 months ago. We secured the largest contract in Morrison & Sons history, a massive mixed-use development project in downtown Scottsdale. The contract alone would keep the company busy for the next 3 years. I hired 5 new employees shortly afterward. One of them, a young project manager named Daniel Carter, reminds me a lot of myself when I was starting out. Hardworking, quiet, determined to prove himself. I make a point of recognizing his work whenever I can, because I know what it feels like to give everything and be ignored. My relationship with my parents has changed too. It isn't perfect, but it's honest now. We have dinner together every other Sunday. Not the tense, performative gatherings we used to have. Real conversations, sometimes uncomfortable ones. Dad asks my advice about the business now. He even asks my opinion about his golf game, which has become his full-time hobby since retiring. Mom has become close with Ethan and Lily. She helps plan Lily's birthday parties and attends every school recital she can. It's strange how different family dynamics can feel once the truth is finally acknowledged. And Josh? We haven't heard from him since the night he stormed out of my parents' house. Mom occasionally checks missing person databases online. She worries something terrible might have happened. But honestly, I think Josh is probably fine. Men like him always seem to land on their feet somehow. They just usually land on someone else's back in the process. Life at home has changed in good ways, too. Ethan officially joined Morrison & Sons 3 months ago. He left his marketing job and now handles client relations and branding for the company. It turns out he's incredibly good at it. In the short time he's been with us, he's already brought in 3 new contracts just through referrals and networking. Next year, we're planning to expand into residential solar installations. That was Ethan's idea. The early projections look promising. Sometimes I think about how different my life might have been if I had stayed silent that night at my parents' dinner table, if I had simply accepted my father's decision, if I had agreed to work under Josh. I probably would still be at Morrison & Sons, but I would have spent every day bitter, watching someone else run the company I had saved. Instead, I walked away. And walking away forced everyone to face the truth. The funny thing is, in a strange way, I'm grateful for everything that happened. Not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced our family to confront. For years, we had lived inside a quiet dysfunction. Josh being protected, me being overlooked, everyone pretending the imbalance was normal. His catastrophic return shattered that illusion. And once it was shattered, we had no choice but to rebuild something more honest. Lily loves coming to the office on Saturdays. She runs around the job sites wearing a tiny yellow safety helmet that one of our engineers gave her. Last weekend, she stood in the doorway of my office, staring at the skyline through the windows. "Mom," she asked, "when I grow up, can I work here too?" I smiled. "You can do whatever makes you happy, but privately, I hope she chooses this path." There's something powerful about building something that lasts, something that grows stronger every year, something that can be passed down to the next generation. The biggest lesson I learned from all of this isn't complicated. Sometimes the people who love you will hurt you. Sometimes family will disappoint you in ways that feel impossible to forgive. And sometimes the only way to protect your self-respect is to walk away from everything you thought you wanted. But if you know your worth, if you refuse to accept less than what you deserve, sometimes the story still ends the way it was meant to. The golden son may have had the head start, but in the end, it was the steady daughter who inherited the legacy. And this time, no one could take it away from me.